Today we're going to take a look at the book of Ruth. It's a story of redemption. Let's start out with an overview of the book, and then we'll talk about it in depth and detail.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line: "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
Very nice overview. Telling us how God can work through people in different circumstances to and achieve his goals in the world. So in chapter 1, the action in the opening chapter is all about Naomi. She is the thread of narrative through this chapter, but actually throughout all of the story from beginning to end. We followed her from Bethlehem to Moab and then back to Bethlehem again. She turns away from the promised land from Bethlehem area to travel into Moab with her husband, I presume, during the time of famine. But then now that her family has decreased, she is going back to Bethlehem because she has heard that the drought is over and that it is a time of plenty again. And she's by herself as far as her husband has passed away, her sons have passed away, so she has no reason to stay in the area of Moab. She would go home and certainly might have friends and relatives there. But Naomi is the object of Ruth's pledge of loyalty. And when Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem, Naomi is the center of the whole town's attention. Ruth was not legally required, nor was it a custom that was expected for her to remain with her mother-in-law. She says in verses 16 and 17, I will stay with you, I will be part of your family, and I will accept your gods. Her pledge of loyalty and love is called hesed, an act that is over and above what's normal or expected. So Ruth's action is part of the pun of her name because the name Ruth in Hebrew sounds like the words for woman friend or satiation or full to overflowing. And full to overflowing, as in the words of Psalm 23, verse 5, which are these words: You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies, and you honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessings. We can look at this verse and realize that it has the meaning of blessing, but it also says in the presence of my enemies. And so just kind of remember that phraseology as we go into the story and look at it more in depth. Hesed is the covenant love. It is a love that binds God to his people. It is almost exclusively used as a word between God and his people Israel. God makes a commitment to Israel and they do not deserve it, but nevertheless they benefit from it. Naomi takes a common sense approach to her future when she tries to reason with Ruth. She sees no way that Ruth could benefit from being associated with her. She has no reason to stay with her. She cannot justify Ruth's decision to cling to her mother-in-law, but Ruth's words and actions are governed by loyalty and love rather than by logic. Naomi may have preferred to go back home without the burden of a Moabite daughter-in-law. After all, Naomi's people, Israel, had despised the Moabites for generations before and after the time in which this story is set. We assume that she may have shared the prejudices of the Israelites against Moabites when Naomi is silent at Ruth's unshakable commitment to accompany her, and that can be possibly viewed as resentment or unease to have her there. This reading of Naomi's reaction to Ruth's clinging is supported by the way she appears to ignore Ruth when they arrive back in Bethlehem. We might say that Naomi did not want to go home to Bethlehem accompanied by a Moabite, reminder of all that she has lost while she lived in Moab. And still, Ruth is an admirable character. She's from an ethnic group that's despised and rejected by those people who call themselves the people of God. So overall, the book of Ruth is a parable about redemption for Naomi and also for Israel. Within the story, Naomi is the primary object of redemption. It's Naomi whose life is turned around and whose feelings of bitterness, emptiness, and hopelessness are reversed. Ruth's faithfulness is only the instrument God uses to accomplish Naomi's redemption. So if we go back into what we learned in the giving of the laws that were recorded in the end of Exodus, the last chapters of Exodus, and throughout the book of Deuteronomy, we can find these words in Deuteronomy chapter 25. If two brothers are living together on the same property and one of them dies without a son, his widow may not be married to anyone from outside the family. Instead, her husband's brother should marry her and have intercourse with her to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law. The first son she bears to him will be considered the son of the dead brother, so that his name will not be forgotten in Israel. And then it goes on to say, if the man refuses to marry his brother's widow, she must go to the town gate and say to the elders assembled there, my husband's brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He refuses to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law by marrying me. The elders of the town will then summon him and talk with him. If he still refuses and says, I don't want to marry her, the widow must walk over to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. Then she must declare, this is what happens to a man who refuses to provide his brother with children. Ever afterward in Israel, his family will be referred to as the family of the man whose sandal was pulled off. Now, if you were reading the book of Ruth, you probably came across the section where Boaz goes to the city gate and waits for the person who is a closer relative to Naomi than he is, and offers him first options to marry Ruth. And he refuses, and there is a scene that involves him removing his sandal as a symbol of the oath that he has taken, that he is giving up that opportunity to marry Ruth. So Boaz took Ruth into his home, and she became his wife. When he slept with her, the Lord enabled her to become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women of the town said to Naomi, praise the Lord, who has now provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. May he restore your youth and care for you in old age. For he is the son of your daughter-in-law who loves you and has been better to you than 7 sons. Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast, and she cared for him as if he were her own. The neighbor women said, now at last Naomi has a son again. And they named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David. On a superficial level, we might say that the story of Ruth is about redemption, defined in a secular manner as the restoration of property to its original owners, or as the healing of a break in a branch of a family tree. The final scene in the story, however, hints at a deeper level of meaning. If the story told in the book of Ruth is to be redemptive for the people of God, well, then the people of God must identify themselves with the one who is redeemed. The story of Ruth and Naomi becomes a story for redemption for Israel, if Israel can be persuaded to believe that the redemptive efforts made by God on Naomi's behalf will also be made by God on Israel's behalf as well. Ruth, the outsider, the Moabite, the representative of a group that in Deuteronomy 23 Israel refuses to admit to the assembly of God, is the agent or tool that God uses to bring about the redemption of Israel or Naomi, because her descendant is King David, whose descendant then becomes the Messiah. In Deuteronomy 23, it says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants for 10 generations may be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. These nations did not welcome you with food and water when you came out of Egypt. Instead, they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in distant Aram, that is Syria, to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to listen to Balaam. He turned the intended curse into a blessing because the Lord your God loves you. As long as you live, you must never promote the welfare and prosperity of the Ammonites or Moabites. And this said for 10 generations. In Deuteronomy 24, it says, true justice must be given to foreigners living among you and to orphans, and you must never accept a widow's garment as security for her debt. Always remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from your slavery. That is why I have given you this command. So we've had two different commands from God. One is not to accept Ammonites and Moabites. Then we had one, how to treat widows. And now we have another one that continues. When you are harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all you do. When you beat the olives from your olive trees, don't go over the boughs twice. Leave the remaining olives for the foreigners, the orphans, and widows. And when you gather the grapes in your vineyard, don't glean the vines after they are picked. Leave the remaining grapes for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. That is why I am giving you this command. So we have those Old Testament commands to back up the story of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. The parable form of narrative encourages us to see not just that we ought to be like Ruth, but that we also are like Naomi. And when we see ourselves reflected in the story as we really are, then the good news of redemption comes to us as a revelation. In Ruth, redemption is based on grace, not merit. Redemption is not a reward given to Naomi because of her exemplary behavior. God chooses to redeem those who seem to have done little to deserve redemption. And God chooses to use those who seem unqualified according to human standards of judgment to accomplish God's purposes in the world. Today, Ruth is read aloud in the synagogues as a part of the 2-day celebration known as Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, which is also called Pentecost because it falls 50 days, that is 7 weeks plus 1 day, after the beginning of Passover. Shavuot is a 2-day Jewish holiday that falls on the Hebrew calendar month Sivan on the 6th and 7th day. The coinciding secular date for Shavuot in this year, 2024, begins at sundown on Tuesday, June 11th, and concludes at nightfall on Thursday, June 13th. So we are in the end of May, and this celebration of Shavuot is coming up in about 2 weeks. According to the Talmudic tradition, Shavuot is the day when the 10 Commandments were given on Mount Sinai. The words represent the first moral law in human history on which our understanding of ethical law is based to this day. That is for Israel, or for the Jewish people. And of course, Christian people also understand the 10 Commandments as being a moral or ethical law. The connection between the festival and the book is both seasonal because of the action of Ruth takes place during the grain harvest, and it is symbolic of God's love for Israel as it culminates in a marriage-like covenant oriented towards redemption. It is Hesed. When Ruth is read between the books of Judges and Samuel, it functions both like a space or a bridge between the end of the period where there was no king in Israel and the beginning of the monarchy. In the opening part of Ruth, it says, in the days when the judges ruled, and that kind of implies that the period of judges is an era that has long passed, that has gone by, and seems quite distant from the upcoming action, which will start taking place in the first book of Samuel. So early rabbinic interpreters say that Ruth was written in order to teach how great is the reward of those who do deeds of kindness. And a modern literary critic says that the moral of the story is common people achieve uncommon ends when they act unselfishly towards each other. What do you think is the purpose of this story? Since many of the writings of the Old Testament scripture take place after the exile or during the exile, Ruth's place in the Hebrew Bible is there to support an idea that developed in the 5th century, and it was a way to cast doubt on the wisdom of the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah as they attempted to cast all foreign wives out as the community of Israel is being restored. The dominant theme is redemption and insider-outsider dynamics. And if this book is read and studied by people who are being forced to choose between those who want to cast out all the foreign influences from their community at the time when Nehemiah is restoring the people back into the community around Jerusalem, then there are those who insist that the house of the Lord should be a house of prayer for all people, like Isaiah says. Then the audiences might have heard the story of Ruth to support the fact that foreign wives should be included in this restoration back to the area of Jerusalem. And in our time, we must consider how people in our country, that is, in the process of tightening our immigration laws in order to protect our identity, will see or hear ourselves reflected in this text. So who should we say seems to play a Boaz-like part in the modern world? Or do we resemble Boaz and the reapers in the field in our dealings with the dispossessed and the powerless in our society? And do we give them pious words in response to their pleas instead of material relief for their needs? Or do we allow those without resources of their own to glean only after we have taken everything we want from our fields? So how is our society? And do we give them the leftovers that we, the pillars of our community, do not want or do not want to bother with? Are we reluctant to set aside perfectly good resources for their use, telling ourselves that they have not helped to grow or to tend them? Are food pantries the modern equivalent of gleaning? What would be the modern equivalent of offering hospitality to an unknown traveler? These are some serious things to think about, and not just reflect upon, but how can we take some action that is biblically oriented? For summer reading, I have a large assignment for those of you who are up to the challenge. I recommend reading a book called The Source. It's a historical fiction. It's very well researched by the author James Michener. It's a long novel, but it's very multi-leveled and very informational about the development of the ancient Near East in areas known as Israel, Syria, and Palestine. It's one of my all-time favorite books. Then, once you have the lay of the land from the source, if you are brave enough, you may want to read The Hajj. It's also a fairly long read, historical fiction, and also very well researched. What's interesting about the book The Hajj is that it's written from the Arab point of view. It's also more modern setting than in the source. Starts out in very, very ancient times when the land is just being settled for the very first times. So the Hajj is from the Arab point of view. It starts around the time of World War I, takes a look at the area of Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, the countries that we know today, and talks about the development of them slightly, as well as then the displacement of the Palestinians in the area. And so it's a very interesting read and may give you some new insight into what's happening in the Near East at this time. I hope that you'll try reading these books. The verse of the day: Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes, and its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought, it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit. This is from Jeremiah 17, verses 7 and 8. Marie Curie said this: life is not easy for any of us, but what of that? We must have perseverance and, above all, confidence in ourselves. We must believe that we are gifted for something and that this thing must be attained. And our closing prayer: Lord, may we trust in you and stand strong like a tree planted by water, firm in the knowledge that our perseverance will bear fruit. And keep in mind, the Bible is a human product, and it tells us how our religious ancestors saw things, not how God sees them. Boaz's favorite pickup line is our joke: before I met you, I was ruthless. And this is our last session for this year. We will pick up again, or for the school year, which we are following. So this is spring, and we're on dismissal for summer recess. We will pick up in the fall in September and continue through next spring. So we have a fall, a winter, and spring session. If you're have enjoyed our sessions, I hope that you will come back, or that if you've not tried us in person, that you will join us. We meet at Crosswalk Church in Napa, and we meet at 6:30 on Thursday evenings in Conference Room 1. Everyone or anyone is welcome.